Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and when we last left off with Thomas, the war had come to an end and occupation had begun. Thomas commanded the Department of the Cumberland, and he immediately went to work asking for aid to give to the displaced civilians. He also instructed all local authorities to take control of their districts and enforce the laws as if secession had not taken place. Thomas dictated that in all civil proceedings hereafter, African Americans must be regarded and treated as a free man. Thomas ordered his subordinates to distribute food captured in Confederate storehouses as well as U.S. governmental supplies. Because Thomas had had significant interactions with the now President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, the Commander-in-Chief requested him to come to Washington to discuss Reconstruction. Word spread that Thomas would be transferred out of Tennessee. The governor of that state, William Brownlow, wrote to Johnson that losing him would be a sad day for the state, and the state legislature drew up a resolution to adopt Thomas as a Tennessean. However, Thomas would not leave the state, or at least not the region. On June 27th, the War Department redrew the boundaries of all the U.S. military commands, setting up 5 military districts: the Atlantic, the Gulf, the Tennessee, the Mississippi, and the Pacific. Thomas was assigned the District of the Tennessee, which included the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. At the same time, the government greatly reduced the size of the army, in particular reducing the cavalry, as this was the most expensive branch of the army to maintain and supply. The breakdown of civil governments during the war resulted in bands of bandits and guerrillas roving over the countryside. Thomas issued orders to his subordinates to drive them out of the country. General Stoneman interpreted the order as executing guerrillas, but Thomas intervened and clarified that they should be captured and put on trial for their crimes. Many Unionists from Tennessee and Kentucky returned to their homes only to find that ex-Confederates were their local authorities. Citizens of those states sought to arrest and put on trial Union soldiers for theft, murder, and property damage for their actions as Union soldiers. Thomas intervened and issued an order on September 21, 1865, that prohibited the arrest, imprisonment, or trial of former Union soldiers for any acts committed while performing their military duties. His order would be made into congressional law in May 1866. In one instance, 2 former soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland had their property seized in an unjust lawsuit. They could reclaim their items if they paid a bond, but they didn't have the money. They got an interview with Thomas, who went down to the Justice of the Peace's office and pledged his own money so that the men could get their items back. Some of Thomas's duties were to make sure elections were conducted civilly. He did post troops at some polls that had the potential to turn violent. His most difficult task would be keeping the peace between whites and blacks. He had come to believe that slavery had degraded African Americans so much that it would be an ordeal to bring them out of such a mentality. But they were more than capable of living as free men and should be treated as such. One problem in this period was labor contracts between the former enslaved and their former masters. When it appeared that freedmen were being difficult, Thomas reminded his subordinates that refusal to work under white supervision was understandable, given the suspicion and distrust excited in the minds of the blacks by the knowledge that their old masters were bitterly opposed to their emancipation and would, were it in their power, again reduce them to slavery. Thomas added that most slaves, when removed from the influence of their former masters and subjected to the restraints of law and military rule, are found to not only be able, but willing, to work for their own support. In July 1865, 2 black schoolgirls and their white friend went into a man's garden to steal some plums. The farmer caught them and ran them off, throwing rocks at them. The girls threw rocks back at the man. The 2 black girls were arrested for trespassing, assault, and battery, and put in solitary confinement with $500 bond. Thomas, sensing that this was a way to get the Freedmen's Bureau school shut down by intimidating the school children, arrested the 2 attorneys responsible for bringing up the charges and suspended the 2 public officials involved. Thomas justified the attorneys' arrest and the officials' suspension by stating that they were persons dangerous to the peace of the community and that they would remain in detention or suspended from office until they demonstrated that they possess a little humanity and a willingness to conform to the laws. 2 episodes became controversial for George Thomas as the commander of this district. On one occasion, the Episcopal Bishop of Alabama intentionally omitted the customary prayer for the president and the government from his worship service. As a result, Thomas suspended the bishop and all of the clergy under him from office. and ordered all the churches closed. Outrage came from the South and the North because it looked as though Thomas was interfering with the free exercise of religion. The bishop appealed to Thomas's actions to the president, and Thomas rescinded his order with a statement criticizing the bishop for interfering with the spread of popular approbation and grateful appreciation of the magnanimous policy of the president in his efforts to bring the people of the United States back to their former friendly and national relations with one another. The bishop had used the sanctity of his position to mislead his congregation back into the labyrinths of treason, and in doing so, the bishop was animated with the same spirit through which temptation beguiled the mother of men to the commission of the first sin, thereby entailing eternal toil and trouble on earth. In another instance, the Methodist leadership removed one of their ministers, John H. Caldwell, after he denounced slavery in his sermons. In September 1865, Thomas ordered the Methodists to reinstate Caldwell. The Methodist elders complained to the president, but Johnson let it be Thomas's decision. Later, the Georgia Conference of the Methodist Church upheld the decision to dismiss Caldwell, and Thomas let the matter drop. In November 1865, Thomas brought Frances from New York to live with him in Nashville. She had visited a few times since the winter of 1864, but now she would be living with him permanently. Ellen, the slave that Thomas had brought from Texas, and who had been left with the Thomas family in Virginia, also returned to him, asking to remain on as a paid servant for the general. Thomas asked her to live independently of him, but she insisted on working for him, so he eventually sent her and her husband and her children to Ben, his brother in Vicksburg, to work for him. Johnson would send Thomas on a mission into Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia to convince those state governments to adopt laws that gave African Americans equal rights and encouraged them to ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. Thomas visited Mississippi and Alabama, all of whom refused to budge an inch to Thomas's pleading. After those two failed attempts, Thomas would not even go to Georgia, knowing it would result in the same failure. In December 1865, Thomas would speak to the House of Representatives on the state of Tennessee and other locations he presided over in the South. He was optimistic and spoke about how the citizens of places like Tennessee were going about their daily lives and transitioning into loyal citizens of the United States. He did believe that martial law needed to remain to ensure that African Americans would be treated equally, but was optimistic about the Freedmen's Bureau's work. Thomas would leave Washington only to be called back a few weeks later to meet with Grant, Sherman, George Gordon Meade, and Henry Halleck to discuss the reorganization of the Army. It was decided to have the standing army consist of 60,000 men, and they authorized an increase in the number of generals, affirming Thomas's major general's rank, although he was a junior in that rank to Halleck, Meade, and Sherman. He wrote to Rosecrans soon after the meeting that, "I do not know but that a man in this country does better by remaining out of the army than in it, because generally speaking, officers have attained higher position in the army entering it from civil life than from within the army." For his own part, however, Thomas added, "I have been so long in the army that I could not live happily out of it, and therefore expect to adjust myself as well as possible. If I can retain my present rank," he concluded, "I shall be content," as he had been accustomed to his ideas not being considered when they conflict with predetermined plans. The years since Robert E. Lee's army surrendered had been relatively stable, but with states being readmitted into the Union and former Confederates gaining more political power, attacks on African Americans would increase. White Southerners would lash out against federal policies that Thomas was expected to enforce.